yes, Cameron, thank you very much for your reading to Cameron. That was really good. I appreciate it. I thought there were going to be very few people indeed here at the beginning, just before 10 o'clock, and it reminded me that a friend of mine in a farming district in the north of New Zealand, where I come from, Methodist church, and he was invited to speak, and when he got there was only one other person. They decided just to have a discussion, I think, rather than try to run a formal church service. It's just exact. I'm interested in numbers, and as it happens, and this was not contrived, it's just exactly 9 months since I came, March the 17th, and it's just sort of interest to me. And on that occasion, and you've probably all forgotten, but I delivered a message called A Man Called Saul. A Man Called Saul. I've sometimes wondered if I went to a place and 6 months later did the same message, offered the same story, whether anyone would remember it.
We remember it.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. I confess, it's the first time I've been to a church for quite a long while, and I heard this yap. It gave me a fright for a little bit. I was a bit more prepared the second time. I've got a message that I hope will be not only relevant to you, but that it will provide at least a mild challenge, if not a strong challenge, to some of you. The reason behind what I'm going to say might not be apparent at the very beginning, but I'm sure you will get it by the end. It's basically along the thought, who does God use? What sort of person do you have to be before God can use you? What experiences do you need to have had? I think it's probably true that all of you in Sunday school days of long ago remember some of the Bible stories, the great heroes, Abraham, David and Goliath's story, the mighty Samson, that lovely story about Ruth. They all sounded so wonderful, such great people, so special, the kind of people perhaps we think who didn't do anything wrong. There were men and women that God used to do very special things. But were they always like that? Were they somehow not just like other ordinary people? Did God have favourites? Are there people like them today? So in my message this morning, I am planning to ask a very basic question. What kind of person does God use for his purposes? Now, when we think of the 12 apostles, we probably think of men, if it's a superficial thought, without faults. People who have been canonized, or men, people we can admire in stained glass windows. And if we do that, we are wrong. God uses very ordinary people, but people who have been transformed by the power of Christ. People just like us. Now, we live in a very qualification-conscious society. These days, our society has set up standards for pretty well everything and everybody. Life is made up of qualifying, going to school, and then later, before you buy a house or a car, or get a credit card, or in applying for a loan from the bank, you have to qualify. Somebody establishes standards that you have to meet. Society, if you like, has determined it will use only qualified people. What does God require of those who serve him? What kind of people does he use to carry out his ministry? What kind of person does it take to advance his eternal kingdom? Are you ready for this? Frankly, nobody is qualified. Nobody. Therefore, God has to use the unqualified to do the impossible. This is essentially, I believe, how God works. To Does that make you feel better? God uses unqualified people, moves into their life with sanctifying, saving grace, and transform them so that they can be used by Him. Those Bible stories that many of us heard about when we were young were of course true. The pages of Scripture are filled with great men and women of God, but the Bible is also painfully honest in showing the weakness and the failings of those people. And they did fail, just as we can. Let me tell you first about a few of the most well-known characters in the Bible. There was Noah, that great man Noah, who on one occasion got drunk and conducted himself in a most lewd, regrettable way. There was Abraham, who doubted God, who lied about his wife, and then committed adultery. His son Isaac learned how to sin from his father. In order to save his own skin, Isaac twice said that his wife Rebekah was only his sister, and he also told lies on other occasions. Now most of us know about Jacob, the swindler. He acted the part of a scoundrel, I think, pretty well. He extorted the birthright from his elder brother Esau. He deceived his father, and he managed to raise a whole bunch of immoral children. Even his favourite son Joseph managed to irritate all his brothers so much that when he was young they had pretty good reason to hate him. So what about Moses? Surely Moses has a clean record, but no. Moses, having been in the courts of Pharaoh, was a murderer. He had to escape. And later in his life, Moses, after many great exploits that God did through him, Moses was forbidden by the Lord to enter the promised land because he acted in pride and tried to steal God's glory. And his brother Aaron was chosen by God to be the high priest, but many of you will remember that shocking incident where Aaron led Israel to worship that golden calf, and then, horribly, there was an accompanying orgy after that. What about Joshua, that mighty man of valor? God told Joshua to destroy the evil Gibeonites, but instead of destroying them, Joshua made a treaty with them. And as a result, the Gibeonites caused Israel untold trouble for many years. Let's not forget Samson with all his gifts. Samson, who led a tragic life because he couldn't control his own passions or his lust. What a sad, pathetic figure he became. Even Ruth, lovely Ruth, who was part of the Messianic line, if you know what I mean, yet she was one of the Moabite tribe, directly cursed by God. What about King David, that all-time ladies' man? Every time he saw a woman he liked, just about every time anyway, he married her. It didn't matter how many others he had. He was not only an adulterer and a murderer, he was a really poor father and a man with so much blood on his hands that God wouldn't allow him to build the temple. One of his many sons was Solomon, the world's leading polygamist. And what about the prophet Hosea? He married a prostitute. Jonah deliberately defied God in direct disobedience and took that famous short ride on a long fish. And then Jonah sulked later on and became totally rebellious when the Gentiles repented after hearing that God would forgive them. Jonah didn't like it. Later, God used Elijah, who could handle 850 false priests and prophets, but he ran rather like a maniac from the woman Jezebel. Now all of these people I've tried to outline were flawed. That's F-L-A-W-E-D. They were flawed in some way. You would have thought, perhaps, that would have automatically disqualified them from being of any use to a holy God. They all failed in a memorable way, and yet, by His great grace, God was able to forgive them all and use them to serve His purposes. Now, what about in the New Testament? When we consider the 12 disciples, what do we find? The Lord picked 12 men who were so diverse. If you study it, it's incredible. They were not especially gifted, and also they were all flawed in some way. Only 12 of them, or really only 11 in the end, as Judas proved to be so unfaithful. And yet these 11 people turned the world upside down. Isn't it amazing what God can do with very few people? But listen, here's the point. God is not limited. He's not restrained by the many or the few. It's as if numbers don't really matter to Him. Those 11 men literally established the church. You and I are the product of their work. They extended the kingdom. Only 11 faithful, humble, simple men just like us. What kind of people does God use? He uses plain, ordinary people just like you and me. God is in the business of accepting unqualified people because, if you really think about it, none of us is really qualified. Let's take a brief look at those 12 disciples. Saint Matthew, tax collector, outcast, the most hated of men. Why? Because tax collectors were used by the Roman government to collect money, taxes, from their own people, the Jews. Tax collectors were considered greedy. They were social outcasts, extortioners. And until he met Jesus, Matthew was a robber, a thief, a traitor first class. Everyone knew that they were liars and that they took bribes. Yet when Jesus called Matthew to follow him, he did, immediately. When given an opportunity to believe, Matthew left everything to follow the Lord Jesus. Now what about Simon Peter? Just about everyone knows that he failed at a critical moment. He could make big blunders. He was impulsive, impetuous, strong, bold. He often talked a better game than he played. Yet look how God was able to use him. God can also use humble, gentle, inconspicuous souls like Andrew, Peter's brother. I think there are 5 New Testament lists of the apostles, and Andrew is always second. It's always Simon Peter first, followed by his brother. He appears to seek no prominence, but quietly brings others to Christ. It is he who tells Peter, "We have found the Messiah." We see his humility. He spent his whole life being known as Simon Peter's brother. And now, when Andrew had found the Messiah, he You would have thought there could have been a temptation for him to say, ah, boy, I'm not going to tell Peter, now's my chance to be somebody. But no, he runs to get his brother, knowing full well that as soon as Peter enters the group, he's going to run it, because that's Peter. And Andrew will be right back where he's always been, as Simon Peter's brother. On the positive side, he's one of those rare people who is willing to take second place. One of those rare people who wants to be in support. He doesn't mind being hidden as long as there is work to be done. He's the kind of man that leaders depend upon. You'll probably remember that in the list of the disciples there are two other brothers, James and John, always mentioned third and fourth, the sons of thunder. James was ambitious. Do you recall that incident in the Gospels when he clamoured for honour from the Lord? He asked if he and his brother John could each sit beside Jesus in heaven. Early on in their relationship with the Master, they were both ambitious, both of them, self-seeking, stalking the favour of the Lord as if he were some despotic ruler who could dispense patronage on some kind of principle of favouritism. Well, James, first brother, certainly had plenty of zeal, great fervour, and he knew the Lord had a special interest in him, so he felt he ought to have an equal reward for all of his capability. Look at that incident, if you don't literally, but I mean in the book of Acts chapter 12, where we are told, now about that time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with his sword. It was James that King Herod was after, the zealous, ambitious son of thunder. Christ had to harness all of that and make all of that into something useful and make him a pillar of the church. The Lord had reminded him, you'll get your reward, James, but it won't be the kind that you think. Before you get your throne, you're going to get a cup of suffering, because the way to the throne is always the way of the cross. He wanted power. Jesus gave him servanthood. He wanted to rule. Instead, Jesus gave him a martyr's grave. Yes, God can use great leaders like Peter, quiet, behind scenes, obscure, faithful people like Andrew, and he can also use the brash, courageous, zealous, sometimes loveless, insensitive and even selfish people like James. Christ brought his temper, not Jesus, but James' temper under control. He bridled his tongue, he directed his zeal, and he taught him to seek no revenge and not to desire any honour for himself. And it finally came to the time and the place where James was willing to die for his Lord. So, both of those brothers drank the cup. For John, the cup was a long life of rejection and death in exile. For James, it was a short flame and martyrdom. Why? God uses zealous, passionate, uncompromising men like James and even Thomas. Thomas, the pessimist, the doubter. He knew what it was to be depressed. He saw the jaws of death. He was willing to die. He was melancholy and moody. Unless I see unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, put my finger into the print of his nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I'm not going to believe.
But when he saw the living Lord, he gave perhaps one of the great testimonies ever given, "My Lord and my God," a monumental statement. Let's not forget Philip. We learn about Philip in the feeding of the 5,000. Simply to test him, Jesus asked Philip what he should do to feed the multitude. The phrase in the New Testament says, "For Jesus himself knew what he would do." Philip answered him, 200 denarius worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that everyone may take even a little. For some reason, it utterly eluded Philip that Christ could perform a creative miracle. Jesus had been healing the sick all day long. All day long, Philip had watched demonstrations of divine supernatural power. You know what he should have said? Something like, "Lord, I've watched you turn water into wine at Cana. Just do whatever you choose. You've got the crowd here, now you can feed them." The Lord had overcome everyone's diseases in that multitude, and yet when Jesus asked him the big food question, Philip says, "It can't be done." Perhaps Philip was also insecure, pessimistic, even skeptical. For 3 years, Philip had gazed into the only face of God that men would ever see, and still he didn't really know who he was. What kind of people does God use in his ministry? Can the Lord use men like Philip? Perhaps when we think about Peter, Andrew, James and John, we have that view of stained glass saints. People who are on a completely different plane from us. And to make it worse, we actually call them, or in some churches, call them Saint Paul, Saint Peter, Saint John. Stained glass saints? No. God uses ordinary first-class sinners if they are willing to be forgiven. Remember Nathaniel? God chose Nathaniel, honest, clear-minded, full of faith and understanding, and yet flawed by prejudice. Now, if there's one thing you'd feel you wouldn't want among 12, it would be someone who was deeply prejudiced. Nathaniel was thoughtful, quiet, a thinker, a man who looked for the Messiah, and God saw the raw material and he transformed it into something he could use. We realise that not all of the disciples had the same level of intimacy with Christ. Not all of them had the same gifts and talents. Yet it is not too much to claim that they affected all subsequent human history. Had they failed, we would not have been here today. Under the energy of the Spirit of God, they began to build his church. Now God had to transform all of them. So what kind of people does God use? All kinds, provided they will come to him wanting to be forgiven. There is just one major qualification. Are you ready for this? God wants not our ability, but our availability. Let me say that again. God wants not just our ability, but our availability. Despite their limitations, once the disciples were transformed by the living Christ, they were willing to give up everything. They were willing to turn their back on their profession, their lifestyle, their homes, their own choices to follow Jesus. They walked away from their nets, from their tax tables, their political involvements, their enterprises, totally committed to following the Lord Jesus wherever he led them. Can I ask you this in closing? Do you qualify? Because if you do, the Lord can and will use you too. I want to finish with something, a statement I've known for years and I couldn't find where it comes from. It should have, it's in my reading of literature. Ladies and gentlemen, the entrance fee into the kingdom of heaven is nothing. However, the annual subscription is everything. Isn't that good? The entrance fee into the kingdom of heaven is nothing, but the annual subscription is everything. May God bless you all. I'm sorry I have to get away. It's been good being with you, and I really mean that. I come from a church where there are 7 separate services on a Sunday, and they're all well attended. We have 5 or 6 pastors, but there's something to be said. Jesus said, you know, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst, and he's with us. Thank you for your leadership. It is a privilege.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming here.